Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Newton, former 60 Minutes producer, former senior producer at National Geographic and Vice on HBO. And I want to talk about Pete Hegseth's progress in the war today. Just to be clear, I worked on a terrorism series for National Geographic called Chain of Command. You can look it up. And it went across about a dozen countries where we looked at the U.S. military's war on terror over a couple decades. And on the ground in war zones, and I covered conflicts for 30 years. That's what I do. So I'm not qualified to be Secretary of Defense, but neither is Pete Hegseth. I mean, he's a U.S. Army major with National Guard experience, and I've probably been in, I'd say probably 100 more firefights than he would ever dream of being in. I've been blown up in a car in a double anti-tank mine explosion. I've been shot in Iraq. I've had members of my team kidnapped. So I've been in conflict zones. So when he talks about the fake news media not knowing anything or not telling the story, I don't think I'm one of those guys. I'm not the fake news anymore. I'm just a commentary, an analyst, and sort of in semi-retirement. But every time I see something he says that's stupid and asinine, yeah, I just want to comment on it because I think he's nuts, and he's certainly not qualified to be Secretary of Defense. Let's take, yesterday, just for the record, yesterday Pete was on there talking about. He wasn't on there. He was his people kicked out photographers from the White House, from the Pentagon press corps because they weren't taking flattering enough pictures of him, which is, this is the Secretary of Defense. He's not supposed to be worrying about that kind of stuff, is he? He's supposed to be, he's supposed to be thinking about fighting a war in Iran. But he's not. He and his staff are thinking about how he looks on television and how he looks in the newspaper when they use pictures of him, which is unfortunate because people are dying out there, and we're fighting a war that we started. So I went back about a week over a press conference he had fourth day into the war, and I was just reading through all his press conferences and things he had to say. And here's one that struck me really. Struck me hard. In the middle of one of his pressers 4 days into the war, he says, they're terrorists after all, and they need to target civilians because they can't fight toe to toe. But we'll find them and we'll kill them. Okay, let's just start with that. I think he's forgotten that on the first day of the war, they dropped a bomb on an elementary school. And they said it was accidental because they had bad targeting information. That's according to the New York Times, who broke that story. So apparently they had bad targeting information, they say, and then they hit this women's school or girls' school, and 130 girls and 30 or 40 other civilians at the place were killed. And that doesn't sound to me like they're fighting toe to toe. It sounds a lot like that first sentence. They're terrorists after all, and they need to target civilians. And the reason I say this is because in Iraq, when I spent a lot of time there in places like Afghanistan, you would see this thing called a double tap all the time. They drop a bomb or set off an IED at some souk or some market. And I used to watch it from my balcony in Baghdad. Boom, massive explosion. 20 minutes later, boom, another massive explosion. But you know what they did at the elementary school? They dropped 2 tomahawks on it. Boom. And then 40 minutes later, according to the reporting on it, they dropped another one. What does that sound like, Pete, to you? What does that sound like? So I'm just wondering who you're talking about. I will mention that usually in those secondary explosions, what I've seen in the past is usually at that point, after the first explosion, all these people are injured, ambulances come, right? Ambulances come to the scene to help the people who are wounded, because not everybody dies usually in these kind of situations. And that was the case in this case as well. So I just want to remind Pete that under the Geneva Conventions and other additional protocols that you would see in war, ambulances and other medical units are protected, Pete, protected, as long as they're being used exclusively for medical purposes and not engaging in hostile acts, which ambulances usually are not when they're picking up the pieces from 135 children who've been blown to bits. And by the way, you would have seen that from a drone. I did a story on drones for 60 Minutes, and we put our correspondent in a parking lot at Creech Air Force Base, and the drone was flying over from 35,000 feet. You couldn't even see it or hear it. And we did a stand-up of that on the runway at Creech. And I was standing right in front of my correspondent, the cameraman was, and we shot her standing like 6 feet away in total, in sort of like a stand-up. And then the secondary picture of her in this red dress or red shirt was from the drone that shot her from 35,000 feet. You could see her perfectly. So you guys have drones and those capabilities. And when you do strikes on that, you watch to see what happens afterwards. So you would have seen that you'd hit a bunch of civilians, presumably. I know you thought it was a military target, you'll say, but you have the capability, if you're watching carefully, to see what you've hit. I've also seen that many times in actual combat, and I've seen it in the Kayak at Qatar, where they hit somebody. They hit a truck one time and some civilians were killed standing close by. So I know you can see it. So the question is when that happens, what does it mean? Well, it means you're a war criminal at that point, Pete. It's a war crime. When you kill people that, first of all, when you hit civilian targets, it's an accident. It can be labeled as an accident. But if you hit any ambulances or medical personnel around that scene, could be a war crime. I'd love to see that video footage of that declassified so we can see what happened 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 20 minutes after that tomahawk hit. And let's remember that your first inclination was to say it was under investigation. The president's first inclination was to say that it was Iranian tomahawks who hit it. Iranian tomahawks. Think about that. So here's some, you always talk about how you have the best intelligence in the world. Here's some intelligence for you and for the president, in case you want to pass this on to the commander-in-chief and all of his wisdom. Remember the guy who said in his first term that he knew more than the generals? Well, here's something that generals probably could tell him. The U.S. military doesn't sell weapons to its enemies, and there's only 4 or 5 countries in the world who have tomahawks, and we sell them to them. And we don't sell them to the Iranians. We sell them to our allies, a few of them, not many. So tell the president next time he says he thinks the Iranians hit something with a tomahawk, that it wasn't a tomahawk. I think he might think that missiles are all called tomahawks in all of his generally wisdom. So we're looking at a potential war crime. I hope somebody's looking at that because, your attitude towards this seems to be kill everybody. And if that was the case in here and we see ambulances hit, I think you've committed a war crime. And the only place it doesn't seem to be a war crime is in Gaza, where your partner in crime, Benjamin Netanyahu, hit hospitals and ambulances with impunity. But we do know that he's been charged with war crimes. He just hasn't been taken in for it yet. So I think you guys need to start thinking about that. The world is not going to give you a free pass on everything. The rest of this, he said, we've taken control of Iran's airspace and waterways without boots on the ground. We control their fate. This is what the fake news misses. This is what the fake news misses, that you've controlled their airspace and waterways without boots on the ground. That's impressive. Let me ask you something. If you control the airspace and waterways, how come in the Strait of Hormuz, which you control, there's been tankers hit by either underwater mines, and the only way you lay those generally is if you drop them in or if you put them in there by boat. So one of those two ways is a waterway or an air, right? Right, Pete? So I'm not sure you do control the waterways of the air. Seems like you're lying again. Yeah. And then another quote you had, our commanders are aware of everything. We have the best intelligence in the world. That's interesting. I mean, if you had the best intelligence in the world, you wouldn't hit a school with a bunch of children in it, right? Because that's a quote from you, best intelligence in the world. Here's something interesting. U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, said the Russians have not been sharing intelligence with Iran to target the United States as it fires off retaliatory strikes on Gulf partners in the region. So Steve Witkoff, if you guys don't know, Pete, is a real estate guy. He's your special envoy to the Middle East, him and Jared Kushner. And he went and talked directly with Vladimir Putin. And Putin said to him, we're not using any of that intelligence to help the Iranians target your people. We wouldn't do that. No, they wouldn't do that. So Does that sound like good intelligence to you when your special envoy comes back and reports that to you? Putin said that? You believe him, don't you? I know Trump does. So that's part of your intelligence apparatus. You hire guys like this, Pete. The president does. He's your commander in chief. He hires guys like this. Great intelligence, right? Great intelligence. Yeah, so the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and they're hitting ships going through there that are not Chinese. A couple Muslim ships have gone through, but a bunch of other ships have been hit and set on fire, and crew members from those places have been, some of those ships have been killed. Okay? So you don't control the waters like you said you did, and you definitely don't control all the air because drones are flying through and hitting government buildings that are owned by Americans in Iraq, not just across the Persian Gulf, but all the way into Iraq. So you don't control anything. What is your definition of control that they taught you when you were a major in the National Guard? Jeez. Incredible. And he seems so proud of it, you know? You said the press only wants to make the president look bad. Here's what you said. You said, but when a few drones get through or tragic things happen, now the only tragic things that have happened are the Americans who were killed and other people who were killed and these schoolgirls who were killed. But you said when tragic things happen, it's front page news. I get it. The press only wants to make the president look bad, but for once to report the reality. Try to report the reality. Well, the reality is there's what, 7, 8, 9, something, that number of Americans killed, that's a reality. That's front page news. When Americans don't get killed, that's what we call not news. Pete, it's not news when parents don't get killed, when soldiers don't get killed. It's not news. It's news when they do get killed. So that's front page news. When you put people at war and you get them killed, it's news. The school bus, that makes it to school is not news. But if it gets hit by a drunk driver, it's news. You understand that? You used to work for a place that called itself news, so you should fucking know that, but you don't, because you're never really good at that either. And it's funny that you call the media fake news. You call the media, you have a lot of fucking nerve calling the media fake news, Pete. You know why? You used to work for an organization that had to pay a $780 million settlement for lying. For lying. You were a part of the fake news, the only fake news. You piece of shit. So that's the reality. Try once to report the reality. That's the reality, Pete. You're a liar and you're part of fake news. That's your reality. So I'm just quoting you. Here's some more news. Hope you guys can see this. Pete, can you see this graph? You see it? Well, let's take a good look at it. That's the price of oil. What it was last month, a month ago. Let's see, hold on. Just make sure I have the timeline right. Yes, that's the price of oil a month ago. And then you go all the way up here, and that's the price of oil now. Okay? $96 a gallon, $96 a barrel. Okay? The strategic oil reserves were depleted, and you guys had an opportunity to put it in the big, beautiful bill, money to fill up the strategic oil reserve, and you didn't do it. In fact, you wanted to get rid of all of it, sell it all, and use that money to give tax breaks for your billionaire buddies, but you didn't put the oil back in there. So that's not going to help when we're trying to ease the oil problems that you've created by starting this war with Iran. You did that. You had the chance to put it back in the bill, and President Trump didn't want to do it, and the Republicans in the House and Senate didn't want to do it. So now we have a 50% of our strategic oil reserve gone. And it's okay to use the strategic oil reserve, but it's also important to fill it back up. Kind of like your gas tank. Pete, when it runs low, you fill it up again. Here's another number for you. You're so proud of the work you're doing, owning the skies, which you don't, and owning the waterways, which you clearly don't. The U.S. military spending by country, $816 billion. Here's a graph. You see it? There's the graph. That big long line at the top is U.S. military spending. And that number says $816.7 billion. Just some perspective for you. The other little countries below it, the next 9 in the top 10 in the world spending, spend $732 billion. So you spend 816 and they spend 732, the next 9 combined. So I fucking hope you're doing well. You're just barely hanging on right now in this conflict, and it's spreading because of you to places like Lebanon and Israel and all the Gulf countries that are getting whacked by Iranian drones because of you, and people attacking our consulates in places like Pakistan. It's spreading. And here's another little stat for you that I looked up. The Iranian military increased its military budget in 2025 by 200%. You know how much that was? 30.9 billion. That's how much they now spend on it. 39 billion. And we spend $816.7 billion. And they're whacking us with their drones. They're $20,000 drones. You fucking idiot. Of course, you're hopefully controlling the skies. Staggering how stupid you are. That number, 30.9 billion, is roughly the same amount we spend. I know I looked this number up earlier. We spend roughly 30.6 billion, just a hair less than them, on just our ammunition. Right? Munitions. I hope you're beating them, Pete. You've been given the keys to the castle and you're still fucking it up. You didn't think about how to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. The Russians are giving them intelligence so they can attack us. And we're asking, with their drones, and we're asking Ukrainians, who we wouldn't give any help to come over and help us with the Iranian drones, which are using targeting information given by the Russians. And what do? We ease the oil sanctions on Russia so that we can ease the world market's oil prices. So we're paying basically Russians are going to be able to make more money off the price of their oil sales, that they will then take money and fight the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are still helping us. When you spend $816 billion on your military, Pete, why do you need the Ukrainians to help you with drones? Go back and watch the Chain of Command series I did. There was a guy named Jeffrey Harigian, 3-star general, fantastic human. You should have put 4 stars on him. He retired. And in our series, in a classified briefing, go in there, you'll see. He's literally, now he declassified it for us. I don't know how you like to attack people who don't have, who you don't like Mark Kelly. He declassified this briefing for us. He went through the classified part, then we went through part of it with him where we saw slides. And he was going through all the iterations that ISIS was using in their drones and saying, here's an iteration of this. They're going to have another iteration, another iteration, another iteration. And we need to stay ahead of this. That was in 16 or 17. So you've had 10 years. The U.S. military has to stay ahead of this technology. And we have not. And that's across all sorts of administrations. Your administration, because you guys, the Trump administration, number 1, took over around that time when I had that briefing. That was on them. And then Biden took it over, but he didn't think he was going to war with Iran. And then you guys took over and you're lost. You don't know what to do with Iran and its drones. It's on you, buddy. Worry less about your pictures at your press briefings than you do about keeping Americans alive from Iranian attacks, and quit giving the Russians sanction-free oil sales. You idiot. That's all I have to say to you today. Like, follow, and share. Please comment. Thanks very much, guys.